Hello, I am Jennifer Ouellette. I am one of the bloggers on Cocktail Party Physics, and I am talking to my fellow co-blogger, Diandra Leslie-Pelecky, if you want to introduce yourself.
And I'm Diandra Leslie-Pelecky, and in addition to blogging, in my spare time, I'm a professor of physics at the University of Texas at Dallas.
Right, and we are talking today on very, very old headset technology because neither one of us, for some reason, can get our headsets to work. So, as much as we've tried. I guess it just goes to show that technology is not all it's cracked up to be all the time.
Yeah, and I'm an experimental physicist, so this is doubly embarrassing for me.
You're supposed to work out these problems in the lab.
But it's one of those things where I swear to God it was working last night when I checked.
Yeah.
But, well, and I just had a graduate student come in and tell me the same thing, and you know what I said? Yeah, right.
Yeah, nobody believes you.
Yeah.
Well, I actually have this new office at UCLA. Normally when I've done this, I've done it from my home office or I've done it from Sean's office at Caltech, and this time it's just not going to work. Totally different phone system. We'll figure it out, but not in time for this conversation. But the one thing that, I do want to talk about right off the bat, because it's what I always, first of all, is how we know each other. And it goes way back, essentially. We've known each other for like 10 years now. Can you believe it?
Oh, I don't even want to think about that, actually.
Okay, well, we should talk about it a little bit.
No, but I remember one specific moment, and I don't think it was the first time I met you, but it was one of the early times I met you. It was at an American Institute of Physics. What are they calling it now? The Industrial Forum on Physics?
Right, and then they had a little workshop on education before that.
And we started talking, and I think that was at the point at which I first ventured the idea that, gee, I might be interested in writing a book. And instead of laughing, which was normally the response I got from people, you said, hey, you should do that.
And it worked, because you came out with The Physics of NASCAR, which I have to say is one of my favorite books of, what was it, last year it came out, right?
It came out last year in February for the Daytona 500. I now sync everything in my life to the NASCAR calendar.
Well, what I loved about that is not only did you write this whole book on the physics of NASCAR, but that you've developed these lasting relationships and friendships with this whole community that would never, in a million years, pick up a physics book.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. That's actually something I blogged about on Cocktail Party Physics, was this whole idea of social networks is fascinating. Because normally the people you know are all in this one little network, like physicists. Mm-hmm. But then there are these people who bridge different communities. And so I was really interested in that because, basically my network shoots out in two directions, physicists and NASCAR people. Mm-hmm. And, it's sort of interesting to see how many steps there actually are between some of those folks.
Well, and it's funny because we actually, not everybody is just in one world. We always have a branching, I think, into a different social sphere. I assume so. It wasn't just NASCAR. You have your physics people and your NASCAR people, but you also have other social spheres as well, I assume.
And not really that many.
Okay. Well, in my case, it's been more, particularly the last 4 or 5 months or so, it's been Hollywood and science, and those are my two worlds. And now everybody I know is either in science or is in movies and television. It's weird.
But what I really like about that is I sort of feel like an anthropologist. You're in there and it's almost like you're mentally taking notes and you're thinking, wow, that's really interesting. That would never fly back in my real life.
Yeah. Well, after a while, what is your real life?
Yeah.
You got to drive an actual NASCAR vehicle.
I got to drive a race car. That was one of the more fun things I've ever done. And it's sort of funny because I'm like the world's biggest chicken. I'm afraid of heights and I'm afraid of all kinds of dumb things. And it just turned out that when I started driving a race car, I just loved doing it.
Are we going to be seeing you at the Daytona 500 next? Well,
one of the things I did was it gave me a real appreciation for the fact that there's a lot more to driving a race car than just stepping on the pedal.
Well, you had actually told me about that. I heard you speak, and you and I had talked about it quite extensively. What I loved was what you had to say about the drivers basically being intuitive physicists, that in fact they are better at gauging the kinds of forces that that they experience as they go around the track and how to respond to them than even, say, a physicist modeling the data would be able to do.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that since we talked, and I think one of the really interesting things is that a car is a really complex object. And, I'm a physicist, so, when I draw a car, draw a spherical car, right?
Right.
It's a point mass, and all the mass of the car is in one place, and it goes around a track. Well, when you get in the car, it has spatial extent. So all of a sudden, you've got to deal with a whole bunch more degrees of freedom. And you have to worry about things like when you step on the gas, you feel a transfer of the weight, and it shifts from the front of the car to the rear of the car. Now, how much grip you have is proportional to how much weight is pushing down on the tires. So when you accelerate, it changes how much grip you have. And trying to model that with equations is really hard. And
That's good to know.
Yeah, at some point, I think drivers always talk about driving by the seat of their pants. I think they just get such an intuitive feeling for, if I step on the gas this hard, I'm going to have this much grip. And they go for it. And so there's sort of two modes of thought in racing. One is that you ought to be able to write a Hamiltonian for a race car, down to every little last detail. And the other is there's no way you can do that. You just, at some point, it's a gut level thing. And I don't know which one's right yet.
You're still trying to figure that out. Because the physicist in you wants the Hamiltonian thing to be true.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because my research has sort of gone from basic physics, basic magnetism, to some biological things. And when you start crossing over into the biological world, things get much less simple. And you at some point have to let go of this feeling that everything should be able to be written as a closed form equation. And as a physicist, that's a really hard thing to do.
Right. So, yeah, I share an office, so we're going to get occasional noises here. But
I have very thin walls in my office. We're going to get occasional noise because I have two Russian theorists who are very enthusiastic about discussing physics next door.
Okay. So every now and then it kind of seeps through the walls.
It sure does. And I wish I understood Russian because they sound like they're having a lot of fun. So you must have all new colleagues now that you've moved.
We're at the California Nanosystems Institute, which is at UCLA. I know you work occasionally in nanotech, particularly now you're working on nanoparticle stuff, so you probably know some of the people here.
I do.
And one of my office mates is a scientist named Jinwoo Chen. And you can hear him there in the background. He's actually working very similar to what you're doing. He's doing nanoparticles related to cancer research. Specifically, I think, brain cancer. So, but that, like you said, that is a new area for you, and the biological world is messy. It's not spherical cows. It's complex, systems and emergent systems and things like that, and it doesn't always fit. And for someone like me, I've been learning calculus over the last year, and I'm writing this book, and I always have to idealize the situation to get the calculus problem to work.
Yeah, and I've been teaching a course on the science of cars. And the goal was to teach non-science majors about how their car works. And I'm going through it, and I'm realizing, okay, so this is a lot more complicated than I thought. How are we going to take this very complicated thing and break it down into bits and pieces that we can get our hands around? But this is one of my main beefs about the way we teach physics is, in fact, one of the people at the race teams told me this. I always ask, do you have any physicists at this team? And one of them said, no, because you guys pretty much think everything interesting is negligible. Racing is all about air resistance and friction. And what do we ignore? Air resistance and friction.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So when you start talking about how a car behaves, it is true that in an idealized world, if you have a car going a certain velocity, you don't have to step on the gas and it will keep going that same velocity. But in reality, you have friction, so it's going to slow down. And every one of my students knows that when you take your foot off the gas pedal, the car slows down. So if you try to tell them that an object in motion at a given velocity stays in motion at that velocity, their experience tells them that's not true.
Right.
Because their experience includes friction.
Right, and that experience is actually far more, that hands-on experience that they have of actually driving a car is going to have a lot more impact on how they perceive the world than the more abstract equations. And they come out of the classroom thinking that therefore physics is not relevant.
That's right. And, I understand why we abstract physics down into, the very simple F equal ma for very simple systems. Because those are the only ones you can solve.
Well, yeah. And like I said, I'm finding for my little sample problems that I'm creating my own for the book, I have to really come up with an idealized example and simplify it, because otherwise I don't have the skills, I don't have the chops to do that. And it would be confusing to the reader anyway if I tried to make it too complicated.
Well, that's actually been one of the fun things is, I started off with the car as a point particle, and then I gave it some spatial extent, and I let it, rotate in one dimension, and then I started worrying about it going around turns. And so I've sort of been adding to my experience of the model, and, that's what physicists do, right? We model things as simply as we can, and when we learn something new, we have to add to our model. But I'm still not sure that you can get to a point where you really have, a Hamiltonian for a race car.
Right. But there are people who specifically study things like friction and turbulence, the fluid dynamics people. I don't know, have you ever considered going into that?
I know an aerodynamicist, Patrick Canup, at Joe Gibbs Racing, and he actually has his PhD from Stanford.
Oh, wow.
In aerodynamics and aeronautical engineering, and he is one really bright guy. And aerodynamics is fascinating, but it's the most counterintuitive thing I've ever thought about. And you can't see it, right?
Right,
So
yeah.
they make all these wonderful simulations. They do computational fluid dynamics, which is just an amazingly powerful tool. But then they show you pretty pictures with different colors, and you sort of are left to go, yeah, that looks like the way it could be. Aerodynamics is tough.
I know. I think for my first book, I was trying to talk about, airplanes and lift and aerodynamics, and I had to simplify it. I basically said, look, I know you're all going to jump all over me for this, but just to keep it simple, we'll use the Bernoulli principle. It's actually much more complicated than that,
Yeah, but I think that's one of the real challenges with being a science interpreter, which I think is a word I cribbed from you. You try to figure out how much your audience needs to know, and you give them that without telling them something wrong.
Right.
That whole thing about, I know it can't be right, but it has to be not wrong. That's
right.
a really tough line to tread, and I've found that the biggest challenge in writing anything for the public.
Well, it's what do you leave out? And, of course, what you end up doing is committing sins of omission.
Yeah.
But you do it for the greater good, in terms of broader communication, because you're going to lose your reader.
Yeah.
So, and it's a tough call, and I think that scientists sometimes forget, as they're reading these, that they're able to fill in the blanks. They know what's missing, and so it bugs them.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've had the same thing happen that I have, which is you do something and you put it out there and someone writes and goes, oh, but wait, you didn't include the fourth order quantum mechanical relativistic corrections.
You're right, I didn't.
Well, not something that's really relevant here. No, I didn't include them, but...
Right. And by the way, only 3 people who read this even know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that you told me was that when you really started working on the science of NASCAR and going backstage, is there's a lot of science there. There's a lot of scientists and engineers that are employed by NASCAR.
There sure are, and in fact, the high-tech equipment that they have is really pretty impressive. One of the nice things about having formed, as you said, these lasting relationships is that I visited Charlotte every now and then. I really like Charlotte as a city. And when I visit, I get to do more stuff. And so, for example, one of my friends let me be there for an engine dyno test. And they basically have this, literally multi-million-dollar machine that you hook the engine up, and the machine lets the engine pretend it's racing. And they can actually get throttle traces from previous races. And so, you can have the engine there, and they'll say, oh, it's doing a lap around Fontana right now.
Interesting. So they basically just match the data.
Exactly. And they're trying to see how the engine responds. So, if it runs at a certain RPM for too long, is it going to give out? And you can watch the oil. There's 22 quarts of oil in a NASCAR car. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, they need it for cooling. You can actually watch it because the oil tank is actually right there, off to the side from the engine. And, it's amazing. You watch the oil foam up and bubble and get hot. It's like watching, the analogy would be watching open heart surgery.
Or, that cool animated video, The Life of a Cell.
Yes.
You actually got to go inside and see what was happening in real time.
Exactly. And it's so much fun because the more I learn, the more I understand, the more questions I have. And I have all these wonderful people who are willing to answer them. And they haven't kicked me out yet, which I really appreciate.
I don't think they would. I think they kind of like having you around.
I think they do, but, there's this inherent tension between engineers and physicists.
Oh, right.
And when I was writing the book, I would ask somebody, what's this? And they'd say, and give me an equation. And then they'd look at me and say, you're not going to make me derive that, are you? No. So I got in a big argument with one of my friends, Josh Brown, who's in the book, about whether grip was a force.
Oh, interesting.
And, look, grip is a force. It's the lateral force that keeps your tires from sliding up the track when you go around a turn. That's grip. But they are working on second-order corrections to grip. And so what they're measuring and calling grip, because everyone has the same baseline grip.
Right.
What they're measuring is some other thing, and I can't say what it is because I don't want to give away any of their secrets.
Oh, okay.
But they're measuring this second-order correction. And someone asked me, well, what does that mean, second order? And I was trying to find a good analogy. And so I said, well, if you buy a new car, and somebody says, how much was it? And you say, well, it's about $25,000. And then they say, well, but how much exactly was it? Well, it was $24,000, $24,395. Well, actually, it was $24,395.62. That 62 cents is the second order correction.
Okay.
These guys are literally looking for differences of 1/100th of a second or 1,000th of a second in a 30-second or 45-second lap time.
Well, that makes a difference in NASCAR.
It does. It can be the difference between winning and losing.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the Olympics in that sense. I mean, they always have these fractions of a second, and you wonder how the hell they even begin to measure them.
Yeah, and you always wonder if actually measuring them, knowing all the things that can go wrong in a lab, and just being a naturally suspicious person, I always wonder.
Yeah. Well, things do go wrong in a lab. I mean that's the both the joy and frustration, I think, of being an experimentalist, is that you never know if it's going to work.
That's right. And if things aren't going wrong, it probably means you're not trying hard enough. Because if you're not pushing your equipment to its limits, you're probably not doing everything you should be doing.
Right.
That goes for racing too. So do you find that same? You must find that same drive in the Hollywood people that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I think so. Again, we're talking about a very different culture, but what you find when you delve into it, and this point has been made repeatedly, I think, is that that same creativity, that same drive to push the envelope of your field and to come up with something new and innovative and interesting and exciting. I think that's something that science and Hollywood has in common.
I agree. That was something I found with the people in NASCAR. What I really loved was their passion. And, you sort of realize, it doesn't matter exactly what people do. If they have that drive and that passion, they're interesting people, and I want to learn more about them.
Right. And they're going to be creative in that sense because they absolutely love what they do. And I think, anytime you get a field that has that element in it, that has people who are just passionate about what they do, and they're in a field that requires a lot of innovation and creativity, you should be able to find common ground with those people.
Yeah, as long as they're both interested in finding common ground.
Right. And I think that, for whatever reason, and it's very good news for the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is the program that I'm now director of. It's a National Academy of Sciences program. That's the reason that I think that the timing is right for this is because suddenly there are people who are interested on both sides of finding that common ground. Yeah,
and that's important because it really is coming together in the middle. I don't think you can have just a Hollywood type do something with science or just a science type do something with Hollywood.
Which I think is what's been tried in the past. Yeah. And, it's fine for one or two projects, but it doesn't actually foster long-term change.
That's right.
So we're hoping that we get to do that. In the meantime, I get to have a lot of fun. I mean, like you, I get to visit sets and sit down with directors and writers.
And have lunch.
And have lunch, exactly.
Lunch.
I mean, we got to do a consult for Iron Man 2.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So nothing I wish I can talk about, but except to say that we were there.
So do they make you sign non-disclosure agreements before you come in?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're shooting now, so of course, they were so close to it they didn't want anything leaking out. But it should be a lot of fun. I think they're really building nicely on the first movie. So now I have all these inside scoops on all these great blockbusters that are coming out next year, and I can't say anything.
So I found that when I was working with the NASCAR, being really careful not going from one team to another, saying something, or thinking that I'd learned something at one team and I actually learned it at a different one. So you must have the same thing. You're at parties and you're thinking, oh wait, can I say it? No, I can't say that.
You just keep your mouth shut and say nothing. I mean, that's pretty much what you do. So, but it's been great. I mean, the fun part was even before I joined the exchange, my husband, Sean Carroll, and I had consulted with the writers of Bones, the TV series Bones, last fall, like September, October, because they wanted to do an episode that we just nicknamed the Death by Physics episode. And it aired, I think, not last night, but last week. And Sean basically polled all his physicist friends saying, if you were going to kill someone, how would you do it? And it turns out that they all had ideas, and now I'm very afraid. I'm very afraid of Sean's friends. But one in particular.
You don't think your friends would?
Oh, my friends, I'm not sure they would know about physics. You might, actually. But we'll get to that in a moment. How would you kill someone using physics? But Juan Calar at the University of Chicago, he searches for dark matter using bubble chambers. And he basically said, well, here's what I would do. And I've given this a lot of thought, and there's one person in particular that I would like to use this on. So he goes, the only caveat is I would not get caught. And, of course, the killer has to be caught in the show.
Yeah.
But they named the fake think tank institute the Kalar Institute after him.
How cute.
And there is a young scientist named Jennifer.
Oh,
Yeah,
I love those in-jokes.
Yeah, it was nice to have these sort of little in-jokes there. And it was interesting because some of what they wanted to know about were, in fact, the culture of science.
Or lack thereof in some cases.
Well, and it was very interesting, or lack thereof, exactly. They wanted to know, initially they were thinking they would set it at like a Mensa meeting, and we told them no, actually no physicist would ever be caught dead at a Mensa meeting. It would have to be a conference or a think tank or something like that. So they came up with the Kalar Institute. And they also wanted to know how Temperance Brennan would be perceived by her academic peers. And this is something that I know you can relate to as a woman in a hard science and also someone who's written a popular book. In the series, Temperance Brennan writes mystery novels based on her work. And I says she would that would hurt her academically. So there's a little subplot there where she ends up investigating with Booth this murder at the Kalar Institute that denied her a fellowship because of her extracurricular work. So I thought that those were really nice elements to get in there.
So I assume you didn't tell them the stories like the person who has conversations with your chest?
No, I didn't. But I mean, I'm sure I could have.
It's fiction. That's okay.
Well, one of the reasons that you and I became friends is because we were usually often the only two women in the room at physics conferences. So, and we were roughly the same age, so we could bond.
And I remember somebody said this when I was a grad student at Michigan State. A woman said this. She said, "I'll know we've succeeded when I don't have to like every woman I meet."
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I would have liked you anyway, but that's an interesting point. Because then you feel compelled to, because thank God there's one other woman here.
Yeah.
So I liked what they did with the Bones episode, and they ended up doing a combination of various ideas, but they did use one's basic idea.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so he can actually, now he's kind of got this like little claim to fame. So how would you do it?
Oh, well, since I work in nanomedicine, I would probably load some drugs onto some nanoparticles made of a polymer that dissolves very slowly over time. And it would be some kind of a cumulative poison, something that you have to build up in your system before you die.
Yeah, that's kind of similar to what Kolar came up with, except that it didn't work fast enough.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. I mean, when you're trying to get drugs out, it's always the problem is how fast do they come out, because they always come out when you don't want them. That's just Murphy's Law.
Right, so you're working kind of on timed, targeted drug delivery.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so the idea is that instead of having to go in for chemotherapy every third day, you would go in once a week or once every 2 weeks, and the drugs would just sort of leach out as you went along.
And it would be fewer side effects.
There'd be fewer side effects because what we want to do is we want to hold them to the tumor with magnets, which, is one of those things that just sounds so simple it can't work, but it does. So then the drugs are running around near the tumor, not running around making your hair fall out and making you sick and stuff like that. So that's the principle. Of course, we're still working on the lab, and my patients are all rats. But
well, see, and this is the thing is that I remember reading years ago that they were using gold nanoparticles that would kind of get embedded in the tumor, and then they could heat them, and it would burn away the tumor. But there's what works in the lab, and then there's what works in the real world, what works clinically. And I think that's the issue, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, that's one of the big issues, because we get a lot of papers to review that are papers that they're making nanoparticles for medical use, and you look at the material and you go, oh, that's great, aside from the fact that it will kill the person if you put it in them. It has all the right magnetic properties. But they say, oh, well, we'll just coat it with something biocompatible. Well, that doesn't always work, folks.
Interesting. Yeah, so and actually this would be a good time, I think, to talk a little bit about, materials and properties and this sort of thing and how you get the properties you want. But there is no such thing as a perfect material, and how do you get it to work? Because materials is kind of your thing. Yeah.
It's a compromise. One of the people in NASCAR, I hate to keep quoting NASCAR people, but they say such great things about physicists. They said, I can tell the difference between a physicist and an engineer, because if I ask them, do you want A or B, the physicist will say yes. Whereas engineers generally realize that you have to make compromises. So it's like,
there are trade-offs.
Exactly. And you try to be at the best of both worlds. And it's really, we do that with the drugs as well. So we're trying to make nanoparticles that will both deliver drugs and will be magnetically targetable, and that we can see with the MRI. And so at some point you give up, being excellent in one thing for being very good in two things. And you have to figure out where that compromise is. But I think that's something engineers learn a whole lot more than physicists do, because, of course, physicists believe there is the one true solution. And when you're working with really complicated systems, there may be a bunch of solutions that are good, very close to each other, but you can't tell if one is necessarily better than the others.
And have you found that this is, before you moved into the biomedicine side, I know you were working more on pure materials physics and nanoparticles and things like that. Is it different when you move into the biology world?
There's a lot more women at meetings.
Oh, good.
And so that was sort of interesting. It's a lot more interdisciplinary. And I've noticed we seem to have little battles in physics about, but that's not really physics.
Oh, right.
And I think there's a group of people who have really moved from being, a physicist or a chemist to being a problem solver. And so our goal is we want to make these particles, we want to test them, we want to see if we can target them, we want to do the MRI. So I need biologists, chemists, physicists, material scientists, MRI experts, and clinicians. And so you go and find people to help you solve problems, and you learn what you need to in another field, which, is interesting because, frankly, why do you don't really want to work with people who know all the same things you know, right?
No, because you all think alike.
And you also do, then, coming back to this anthropological thing I'm fixated on, you work in other people's environments and other people's cultures. And, for example, when we were working with folks at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, we would go there and we'd have samples all over the table, which, are rat organs. And then they'd order out for lunch. I was like,
and they think nothing of it.
Could we move those? That's really grossing me out, guys. And they just look at me like, what? It's a rat brain. Yeah, I don't want it on the table when I'm eating. But, if I weren't as squeamish as I am, I probably would have been a medical doctor or a biologist.
I always thought I would want to be a forensic pathologist.
Yeah, see,
all my favorite shows are that involve cutting up people.
Yeah, see, that's just in the abstract, that's great. In reality, I'm not going to survive that.
Yeah, there was one of my favorite lines from CSI is where one of the characters, Sarah Seidel, had to essentially go through the belongings of a liquefied corpse, and of course, this smell just attaches it to herself. Right about the time a really handsome, rescue worker wants to ask her out, and he's starting to ask her out, and all of a sudden he gets this funny look on his face, and she says, "I smell bad." He goes, No, it's not that bad, and it's clear he's about to retch, and they end up having to postpone their date.
Yeah.
And so he walks off, getting ready to throw up, and she's sitting there feeling great. There goes my one chance at a life. And one of the lab technicians, Gray, walks by, comes back and goes, "You smell like death." And she goes, "I know, I've heard." And he basically says, a real man wouldn't mind. And then kept walking.
It's all perspective.
It's all perspective, yeah. It didn't bother him.
No.
But that's quite the test of manhood, I think.
Yeah, it's funny how you associate smells. I cannot stand the smell of Alkanox, which is a detergent we use in the lab. And
that's unfortunate.
It gets me out of washing a lot of dishes, right? I could not for the longest time figure out why. And I finally realized one day when I was visiting my dad when he was still alive in the nursing home, is that's what they use to clean things and sterilize things. And so I associate that smell with my dad being really sick.
Oh.
And every time I smell it, I get this feeling and it's not like a physical, I'm back in the nursing home, it's just this queasy, uncomfortable feeling.
Mm.
So but you do associate those smells. The smell of brake cleaner and gear oil for me. When I smell that, I know I'm at a racetrack.
And you like it?
I love it too. It's sort of sad. I took a friend of mine, the rocket scientist, to the race in Texas a couple weekends ago, and they were peeling out and smelling the burning rubber, and I was just going, "Oh, I love that." And he just thought that was really strange.
Well, to each his own. But I love the fact that you just fell in love with this NASCAR thing after, basically.
Yeah, and I think my husband is sort of surprised I haven't moved on to something else yet. Literally, because I talked to Tim Gay, who's one of my colleagues at Nebraska who wrote The Physics of Football, and he said, "Oh, you're going to be able to go in there and tell them a lot of stuff because you're really going to understand the physics of it." And that's what he found with football. I went into NASCAR and found out that, oh my gosh, these guys know a lot more stuff than I know about this. So it was a very different situation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. More complicated than football, or?
Because you don't have to know the physics of football to play football. Mm-hmm. These guys, they have very well-defined jobs, and they go out and execute those jobs. You have to understand the physics to put together a race car that wins.
Right.
And
especially, it's gotten very competitive. And
it has. And whoever understands the science the best is the one that wins. So everyone wants to understand the science. I think you can be a really good football player without understanding the science. So why work at it?
Mm-hmm. Right. In fact, it might hurt you. You might end up overthinking.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons most of the race car drivers are not scientists. And in fact, the ones that I've listened to who do have degrees, they tend to give you a lot more information than you probably need when they're trying to tell you about the car.
Right.
Whereas a lot of the other drivers, I think they're just sort of in the zen flow of it, and they know what to tell you when they're in the car and it's not behaving the way they want it to.
Right. It's interesting because I've actually, gotten interested in the whole physics of cars, particularly energy and gas mileage, because it's coming up in the calculus book, and because I own a Prius.
Yes.
And so they have those little onboard motors, that little onboard computer that basically tells you how much gas you're using, miles per gallon of this sort of thing. And it trains you. You learn the tricks.
So do you know how complicated a Prius transmission is?
No, I do not. I mean, I've done some reading,
goodness.
and it makes my head hurt. So maybe you can tell me how complicated my transmission is.
How long you got?
Because I'm pretty sure that, I'm very careful to take it in for its 5,000-mile tune-up, because I think anything goes wrong on that thing, nobody I know can fix it.
It's interesting because I told you I'm teaching this course on the science of cars. Well, we're in the waning days. I only have 4 classes left. And the last unit has been on electric cars, hybrid cars, and hydrogen-powered cars. And so I wanted to talk about the Prius, and I thought, well, I'll just look up how it works. Well, it's pretty complicated.
It makes my head hurt.
The electronics that are used, basically, it's constantly monitoring to figure out how to make the engine efficient. And it does a lot of that by actually taking away control from the driver. So whereas, in an old car, you push on the throttle, you go. In this car, if you push on the throttle, the computer determines how fast you're going to change your speed.
Does it?
Yeah.
Is that why I can't accelerate as fast as I want?
Well, yeah. My guess is that a Tesla Roadster would not accelerate as fast as you want, but
yeah,
that now is my dream car.
The Tesla, they're beautiful.
Tesla Roadster, they look beautiful, and I was really impressed with all the thought that went into them.
We were at a party last December, and Elon Musk was one of the guests, and he drove his Tesla. And it's like everybody left the party, just go and stare at it.
I bet. I bet.
Everybody was out on the sidewalk going, ooh, pretty. And it can go from 0 to 60 really fast.
Oh, yeah.
So apparently they've got a new one that they're coming out. They're coming out with like a sedan version, and they're coming out with an even better Tesla Roadster.
Yeah, the sedan version, they're claiming you're going to be able to charge it in 45 minutes.
That's amazing.
Yeah. In fact, I just did that with my students. I just came from class, and I actually just had them calculate out, if you had a 480-volt outlet, which is what I think it's going to take to do that, how much amperage would you need? We got a really big number. We're not sure that they can actually do it, but I don't think that car's due out for another 2 to 3 years, although they're taking orders now.
Yeah, well, they do that.
But it's going to be reasonably priced. It's going to be under $50,000.
Right, and that's, I guess, reasonable for some people, probably not for us,
Yeah, but if you
I just
really, really want an all-electric vehicle,
that it would be worth it, absolutely.
And you're not willing to make compromises.
Right.
Because there's a lot of other cars coming out right now that, are electric or are mild hybrids, varying degrees of quality and space inside. And, if you really want a car that's going to be just like a regular internal combustion engine car, except it's electric, I think the Tesla is really the only performance car.
It's the only game in town in that respect. And, we might as well not hold our breath for hydrogen, even though there's going to be a lot of investment in it. There's a lot of challenges, I know that much.
Yeah, and that's the unit I've been working on writing recently.
No.
So, yeah, the hydrogen is interesting. It's so much of these things are pitched to us as this is the solution. And the more you look into it, the more you realize, it's not that simple, folks.
Well, I don't think there's going to be any one solution. I think one of the things I like the hybrid is the Prius is that it doesn't try to find one solution. It has a lot of different elements that it tries to shave off little incrementally weight. It tries to recapture some of the lost heat from braking. It tries to just little tiny bits of energy anywhere it can find it. It tries to recapture that.
And the aerodynamic profile.
Yeah. And over time, all that stuff adds up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was trying to find an exciting way to talk about the drag coefficient, and I couldn't. If you got any suggestions, I'd be happy to hear them.
I'll have to think about that one, because, because with the Prius, it's a really big deal, because I think the drag coefficient is like 0.2, 0.25.
Right.
I'm doing this from memory. I think most cars it's between 0.3 and 0.4.
Yeah, so the Prius knocked a lot off.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a fairly light car.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's the only way you're going to get it over 50 miles per gallon, right? Is to take advantage of every trick. And I think the Prius is still using low rolling resistant tires to decrease the friction between the road.
Right. Which, makes me wonder if that couldn't be dangerous or not, but I haven't had any issues with it, so.
Yeah, for everyday driving, I don't think that's an issue.
Yeah, maybe for NASCAR.
Yeah, well, they're not racing Priuses yet.
And I don't think they will.
Well, I was at a conference, a motorsports conference, and there is a green racing series.
Really?
Yes, and the American Le Mans series. They're running on ethanol, and they have all these criteria. They're working with the Department of Energy and the EPA to decide what green racing means.
You've got to define it first.
Yeah, well, they're actually racing this year, and you have to use an alternative fuel, and the Department of Energy has all these criteria for what an alternative fuel is. So like E10, gasoline with 10% ethanol, is not an alternative fuel. E80 is, but in between it's actually a little murky.
Okay, so they're just trying to find where the cutoff point is.
Yeah, well, it's the government has to decide at what point are you eligible to get rebates.
Mm-hmm.
But with the racing, they're trying to look at some of these things. Formula One is looking at kinetic energy recovery systems. They're going to do the same thing. It's basically regenerative braking. They're going to store the energy in either batteries or capacitors, and then they'll be able to use that energy as a boost, which should help them be able to pass. And the goal of doing that was, hey, can we put all these brilliant people to work coming up with something we might use on passenger cars? And so
Eventually.
Dual
use.
Mm-hmm. And so I really like that. I think that's
a great idea. I wasn't even aware of that.
Yeah, they've had a little bit of implementation problems. They had someone get a really bad shock from one of them.
Really?
Well, it's like any new technology.
Yeah.
One of my friends who works in racing said, and he used to work for GM, he says, what I really like about racing is if you get an idea, 2 weeks later it's in a car. Whereas in production vehicles, 2 years later you might see it in a car.
Right.
So racing is good because there's this short time response if you want to try things out.
Right, and you know right away if it works or not, and whether it's even feasible.
Yep.
So, see, that's interesting. That's the thing. I have been noticing, that the drag. Yeah, I noticed that when I did a road trip through the mountains I drove essentially from LA to Salt Lake City, and there was this mountain pass. And normally I was kind of thinking, oh, great, I can coast all the way down after climbing up, and I'll get great mileage. But there was a really, really strong crosswind, and it just killed everything. I mean, it was strong enough to stop the car going downhill. I actually had to push on the gas to get the car to move.
Really?
Yeah, it was they had wind advisories up, and a semi turned over.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was really strong.
Yeah, I wonder what the drag coefficient is if the car is moving parallel.
Exactly. It's big, I think, would be.
Yeah.
Just based on what I felt and what I saw happen to the semi. So it was a little on the top-heavy side and just went right over.
It's the power of air.
Yeah, and I don't think we actually think about that in the same way we don't think about the power of waves in the ocean.
Yeah, it's one of those things about being able to see something, and I think that's one reason why a lot of the educational innovations, one of the big ones is, having applets, ways that you can visualize electric fields and magnetic fields, for example.
Well, because they're invisible,
and I know with my students, it's really hard for them to accept that something is there if they don't see it. And you can do iron filings on a magnet, right? You can see the field then. But then thinking about how it moves, one of the things I'm really looking forward to as we get more 3D video and animations is actually being able to fly through a magnetic field. And in fact, I was at UT Arlington a couple weeks ago giving a talk, and Ramon Lopez, whom I know you know, had these wonderful 3D videos where you flew through the Earth's magnetic field.
Oh, that's weird. That's great.
Oh, and they were amazing quality. And you felt like the field lines were coming right at you. It was really, really impressive.
It's funny because they have something similar. I mean, Sean was just showing me this online at there's a sister Nanosystems Institute up at UC Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
And they have something there. It's a kind of art/science project called the Allosphere. And the woman who's behind that actually gave a TED Talk recently. and described the kind of work they're doing, where they're basically allowing it's being used for scientific visualization, but they're using essentially acoustics, sound, to feed back the data so that they can walk through, say, an atom or a cell, and the feedback, the data will come back to them in acoustic or sound format.
Yeah, and see, I think this is going back to, the driving a race car and getting a feel for it.
Yeah.
We're getting all these tools, because I always think about data. I tell my students, you need to get inside the data. You need to just, and we use all these metaphors, you need to dive into it. You need to surround yourself with it. Mm-hmm. We're thinking of new ways to see patterns, because especially when you're dealing with complex systems, you can't just look at it and go, oh, it's a straight line, because it's not going to be a straight line. It's going to be more complicated. But things like acoustics and color. So one of the things with computational fluid dynamics is they use different colors to show different regions of pressure. Mm-hmm. And when you look at that, it's like all of a sudden you go, oh, that's why it's pushing down on the front wheels. It's this way of understanding it that you wouldn't have if all you had was a black and white drawing with lines.
It's very interesting because initially my next book was going to be on acoustics, and then I quickly found out that I needed to learn the Fourier transform if I was going to at all talk about this, and that meant learning calculus, and then I just got off on this tangent. But one of the things that I did was visit an infrasound lab in Hawaii. A man named Milton Garces runs it. And we were talking about acoustics and the kind of work he does and wavefronts. And he says, because this is Hawaii, he says, if you really want to understand the dynamics of a wavefront, we should take you surfing. And it was the most generous thing. He and his wife essentially loaned me their gear and took me out to one of the little, local surfing spots and spent several hours teaching me to surf. And it's true. I mean, you end up developing this intuitive sense of the wavefront that then you can then match to your abstract notion of what a wave is. And suddenly your understanding becomes that much more complete.
Yeah, I think that's one of those, if you look at birds who are sitting, I like going to Florida and watching pelicans. I don't know why I like pelicans. They're just cool birds. But they sit on the waves and they just bob up and down. And that's one of the things we always teach about waves, is they don't actually transport mass until you get close to the point where they break. And if you look at a bird sitting out there in the ocean, he is just bobbing up and down in place. Mm-hmm. And it's a great visualization in nature of something that we try to pound into our students' heads over and over. Feeling it makes a huge difference.
Right. And, this was the big breakthrough for me with calculus, because, again, we teach this in a very rigid, abstract, formal way, and to some extent that's good. I mean, you do at some point need the rigor, but you can't ignore, the intuitive aspect as well. And it was funny because I was thinking about why calculus was a stumbling block for so many people like me who don't have it naturally. And I think it's because we come through our lower education and we think we're memorizing multiplication tables and we're learning arithmetic and we're memorizing geometry rules and things like that. And we're just learning the basic tools. And we get to calculus, and suddenly calculus is basically about creatively using all those skills you've built up. And we don't know how to do that.
Yeah, in fact, I was just talking to Lee, one of our other co-bloggers on Facebook, and I was complaining because my students like to seem to see how close they can get to the notes when they write an answer without actually copying them.
Right.
And she put it really well. She said it's because we're teaching students what to think rather than how to think.
Exactly.
And I think that's a big problem with how we're teaching kids, especially in K-12 with No Child Left Behind, is we're teaching them to memorize, regurgitate, and toss away.
Yeah, just get the score and move on.
Yeah, and when you try to get them to write a creative answer or a supportive point of view, or I asked them a question, the government were going to put money into one biofuel, either ethanol or biodiesel. Which would you suggest and why? And they were just baffled. They didn't know what to do.
Well, and it doesn't help if there is no one right answer here. You have to build a case and make an argument.
Oh, and they hate that.
I know. They want to just give you the answer.
Yeah, they just want to know what the answer is. And it's like, no, I want you to think so that when you go out to buy a car in 10 years and you have to decide, do I want a biodiesel car? Do I want an ethanol car? Do I want a hybrid? That you can make an intelligent decision because you'll know what each of those things is and what it means.
And it's funny because this is another thing. Sean and I, as you know, just bought a house. And we went through this whole home buying process. And I'm actually using it in the calculus book because it turned out that, looking for a house conceptually is about the same as what I believe is called a multivariable optimization problem.
The traveling salesman.
The traveling salesman. You've got a list of variables and you're trying to find the optimal solution. You're not going to get all of them. There's no perfect one. Mm-hmm. but you want to find the one place that has the most of what you're looking for within your price range and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think putting it in those terms, people kind of get, because most people have to do that kind of comparison shopping.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
And then say, okay, and the calculus is just formalizing that. That's just a tool you use to basically quantify it.
That's a great analogy.
So, it's going to turn out to be, and so that's what I'm doing kind of in every chapter, finding a real-world problem, saying, and here's how you quantify it. And the quantification part is challenging. I am never going to be great at calculus. I think I can say now with great confidence. But I do think that I have achieved, a certain insight into why it's important and how it's used, and it's changed my attitude towards math. It's not a rote, rigid system, not at the level at calculus when you're actually using it to solve problems, because you make it do what you want. You invent, what you call the variables. You can call it T, you can call it A, you can call it X, you can call it Jennifer,
Yeah, that's something my husband likes to use, the analogy is that, if you're going to learn a musical instrument, you learn scales and these little etudes before you can go on and play big pieces of music and maybe even write your own. And the problem is the way we teach science, most people never get beyond the scales stage.
Right.
And so they don't appreciate the creativity and the beauty and the fun, because all they've been doing is playing scales up and down, and they can't see what it's good for.
And I was classically trained as a pianist growing up, and the way my instructors got around that was, yes, I would do the etudes and the scales and this sort of thing, but they would also play me music, would be kind of / music appreciation. They would play a Beethoven sonata or a Chopin ballade, and they would explain how the chromatic scale that I was practicing over and over again would help me one day play Chopin.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and the problem is it's so easy to not make those connections.
Right. So, and I don't have a solution. I mean, I know there's lots of really smart people working on science and math education, trying to come up with a solution to this, and I don't know if there is one, because I don't think our education system is more of an industrial model, and I'm not sure that it's conducive to this sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm beginning to think that maybe what we need to do is really expand the community colleges and let people get like a 2-year or 3-year really focused degree. So if you want to go into advertising, we'll give you the stuff you need for advertising. The basic math, all the business courses, graphic arts, something like that. And then leave 4-year colleges for people who really want to learn. Mm-hmm. Because I think what we're doing is reducing 4-year colleges to trade schools.
Yeah, and certainly that's how a lot of people view them. I mean, the idea is, well, you've got to go to college because you'll never get a good job. And they didn't used to be that. They used to be liberal arts, but back before liberal was a bad word, when it actually meant good, a place to explore and think and question.
Yeah, and with the students, we train the questioning out of them in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't help any. But many of them are focused on, they really just want to go out and get a 9-to-5 job, and the job is not going to be their life's work. And I think that's hard for people like me who, when I jump into something, it's pretty much with both feet.
Right. No, and I'm a writer, and of course, it's not a job, when you love what you do. It's simply what you do.
Yeah.
And you get paid for it, which is awesome.
Yes.
I mean, every job, every career, I think, has its frustrations. I know you just moved to a new lab, and starting the lab up from scratch, I'm sure, is just, horrible.
Oh, yeah. It's like moving your house, but worse.
Yeah. But, I mean, you obviously love your work. Mm-hmm. You're doing something relevant. You love solving the problem, and, you're actually doing something that's going to help people. You could help treat cancer.
We hope so.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what my writing will do, but,
Well, but that's always the problem. You never know what the impact of what you do is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've had this happen. People contact you. When you write a book, people contact you, and you get all kinds. There's always the guy who has figured out a perpetual motion machine, and the one who's proving Einstein's theory of relativity is totally wrong.
Right, the cold fusion
people.
Yeah,
the cold fusion people. But I get people who write and say, I never thought I could understand science, but now I can. And that is such a joy, because now I feel like I can pick up a book and I can really understand it.
And it's interesting because I actually do hear that occasionally, when I talk to writers here in Hollywood. They're really smart people here, but they've gotten convinced that if it's science, they can't understand it, and I think a lot of them are beginning to realize that it's a communication gap more than anything. It's not an understanding gap. It's not an intelligence gap.
Well, you're back to the language differences between the cultures.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's the same thing. In NASCAR, there's certain language I picked up. Not all of it was good to use in mixed company. But, they call things a different way. They use different phrases. And you can't communicate until you learn both languages. And so I think if you're going to write a book like that, or, your calculus book, you are learning another language. You're learning another culture. You have to jump in with both feet and learn that.
Right.
But I think that's sort of fun.
Yeah, it can be. There have been a couple moments when I've wanted to bash my head in the wall, but that's, they're few and far between. In the long run, I think it's very fulfilling.
I can't imagine writing a book and like doing a biography of someone, and as you get to know them, you realize, I really don't like this person. To me, that would be one of the circles of hell.
Yeah. We've probably got about another 4 minutes here, so I wanted to talk a little bit, getting back to NASCAR, because I know that you just finished this TV program, and you haven't blogged about it yet, but you promised you would.
I know. I'm so far behind from it.
We have been very, very bad at blogging, all of us, because we've been so busy, but I finally have an assistant, and so I think I'm going to be back on board.
Yeah, what we all need is a wife.
Yeah, pretty much.
Which is a job description.
Exactly.
No, it's called The Science of Speed, and it's on NSF's new website, which is science360.gov. And this is a website where they are trying to bring science direct to the average person. So it's not meant to be a science news site for, all the real science literate people who are reading Nature and Science. But
so they're not preaching to the converted.
Right. They're trying to show where there are interesting things. And they've got a real wide range of things up there. They've got everything from articles in Nature and Science to blogs, like John Tierney's blog from the New York Times pops up every now and then,
right,
to a lot of content from Discover Magazine. So I'm guessing that your blog that you do through Discover is probably up there at some point or another, too.
I'm with Discovery News.
Discover.
Yeah,
See, okay.
Sean is with Discover. And,
Sean, okay. I can't keep the two of you straight now,
now
that you're one.
Exactly.
So we did a series of 12 little 5.5-minute videos on the science of speed. And what was really fun was I got to get a bunch of people from the book involved. So I got them on screen. So if you wondered what some of these people looked like or sounded like, you can actually see them now.
Oh,
so
that's
I know
great.
When I read books, I want to know what the characters look like.
Right.
And then I also met a whole bunch of new people, which was really great because I've got a whole bunch more people to spread my questions out over now. But we found some people who were really, really good at taking complicated ideas and explaining them simply. And I think that's because they work with people from a wide range of educational levels, all the way from PhDs down to people, who went to trade school.
Okay.
And they just gave us great examples. And what I really wish we had time to do was to edit the outtakes. So, for example, we were asking everyone, what's drag? And everyone takes their hand and sticks it out and goes, well, if you take your hand and you stick it out of the car window, it's what you feel. Except for Brandon Thomas at Red Bull, who says, well, I'm not going to use the hand out of the window example because that's stupid.
Outtakes are always fun. They're crowd pleasers.
They are, and especially, I'm sure we've got some good ones of me because we started off taping them like in the lobby of a race shop. Mm-hmm. And then the last ones we actually did at a track. We did it at Daytona, like during practice.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so I'm standing out in the infield, and what we're trying to do is have a car come around right after I finish saying my line. They're practicing. It's not like we have someone in a car driving around to do this.
Yeah.
So we're trying to calculate out, well, how long, at what point when the car is here, when do I start talking? How fast do I start talking? So there's a couple of places where it's like, there's a reason for that. We were trying to get it out before the car came.
So you've actually done quite a bit of on-camera stuff now, and was it what you expected? I mean, what did you
talk about culture shock?
It's a bit
so
of a
what's really funny is
shocks.
if you look at the videos, anyone that you see a Hendrick Motorsports car in, and it's in a lobby, I look like a deer in the headlights. Those were the first ones we did. I know it was like power and drag and drafting, and at least one other. But literally, I'm standing there and I was asking him, can I move when I talk? Can I turn my head? Or should I hold it still? And then if you look at the later ones, like fire suits or sound, which we did at a track, I'm a whole lot looser there. So I learned quite a bit doing it. And the biggest surprise was I learned I liked doing it. Because I really wasn't sure I was going to like being in front of the camera. I had this vision I was going to be on my 23rd take, and everyone was going to be glaring at me, and because I couldn't remember my lines or something. It turns out, no, I was actually okay.
Yeah. It's funny because when I was at the Cobley Institute, I was a journalist in residence there last year, and I brought an actress in, a local actress, to essentially help the physicists with their body language when they were giving talks. And she prepared by watching a lot of their talks and just said, my God, they just never move.
Yeah.
You know? They're just like these little tight, cramped, people, and they never move and they never make use of the space,
Yeah, I think that's because we're usually focused so hard on what we're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, one of the nice, I think this is a good thing about doing video, and you've shot some things, so you know how it works.
Yeah.
They tell you, say this line, walk 3 steps, end up here, stop, look at the camera.
Right, here's your mark, go.
Yeah, and so it's very well choreographed for you, so you can focus on what you're saying and not so much on what am I going to do, where am I going to go.
Yeah, but a talk is a lot harder.
Yeah, I think in a talk you're focused really hard on what you're saying.
Right.
And then, of course, we're not trained to be theatrical. We're not even trained to be aware of it.
Right. I took one private lesson from her, and it made a world of difference. If I had the time and money, I would do it. I would take a lot more acting classes.
And of course, you have a great voice.
Well, we'll see. Thank you.
Well, remember, I told you the time I was in San Francisco, and I woke up in the middle of the night because I listen to the radio at night because I have a really bad insomnia. And I woke up and I heard your voice. You were doing the Art Bell show.
Oh,
on Coast to Coast.
right.
I think it may have been before Art was doing it again. But I remember hearing your voice because you have such a distinctive voice, and I remember thinking, she's got a really good voice for radio.
I should do more radio.
Yeah.
That show was very interesting because for like 2 weeks after, every schizophrenic in the nation was like emailing me. It's like, and insomniac.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things when things come out in a certain market or a certain kind of media, the people that flock to you.
Right.
It's really interesting.
So if they never had me back on, then they probably won't. I was far too skeptical for them.
I think you have to buy into something.
Right.
Like Bigfoot or
something, HARP, some
the
sort of
chupacabra.
some conspiracy theory thing. I did score points by bringing up infrasound and ghosts. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that resonated with people, so to speak. So.
Yes.
Anyway, I guess that's pretty much our time, but I'm glad we finally got a chance to do this.
Yeah, we need to talk more often when we're not having to stare into a video camera.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to get out to LA sometime summer, early fall.
Okay, great. And at some point, Sean and I will have time to come out and do a dual colloquium there at Dallas.
Yeah, we need to do that.
All right. Okay, so I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
All right, bye.